If Detective Mark Harris hadn't taken that left turn, he would have never seen the dog. And if he hadn't seen the dog, 23 children might still be locked away in the dark. It was one of those cold November afternoons in Mason Creek, Vermont, when the daylight seemed to give up early. The streets were quiet, the trees stripped bare, and the smell of wood smoke hung in the air. Mark had been on the force for nearly 15 years, the kind of cop who didn't scare easy and didn't jump to conclusions. But that day, something got under his skin before he even knew why. He was idling at a stop sign when he spotted it, a large German shepherd, sable coat rippling in the wind, sitting on the curb across from an old, weathered two-story house. The place looked like it had been abandoned since the Carter administration. Windows clouded with grime, shingles curling on the roof, porch railings sagging like tired shoulders. But the dog wasn't just loitering, it was staring. Rex, that's the name Mark would give him later, sat with his body perfectly still, ears forward, amber eyes locked on the house's front door as if he were waiting for it to open. No sniffing the air, no twitch of distraction, just that unwavering gaze. Mark rolled down the window. "Hey, buddy," he called softly. The shepherd didn't so much as blink. The light turned green and Mark drove on, telling himself it was nothing. Probably belonged to someone nearby, maybe guarding a squirrel stash or just keeping watch. But 3 blocks later, the image of that dog's posture still had its claws in his mind. He knew working dogs. He'd been paired with canine units before, and this was no random stance. This was focus. The next day he took the same route on purpose, and there Rex was again. Same spot, same posture, eyes glued to that old house. Mark pulled over this time, stepping out into the bite of the wind. "Where's your owner, pal?" he asked, scanning the street. No leash, no collar, no one in sight. Rex's head turned slightly at the sound of Mark's voice. Acknowledgement. But then his gaze snapped right back to the house. Mark walked a few steps closer and Rex tensed, not in fear but in warning, like, "Don't mess this up." For a moment, Mark had the strange feeling the dog knew something he didn't. 2 more days passed. On the third, Mark caught himself watching the clock, timing his patrol so he could swing by that corner. Sure enough, Rex was there, statue still. The house loomed behind him, peeling paint like sunburnt skin, yard choked with weeds, one shutter barely hanging on. Something about the scene gnawed at Mark. He'd heard whispers about the place over the years, kids daring each other to spend the night there, rumors of squatters or strange noises. But every time a unit had checked, it came up empty. Yet here was a dog who refused to look away. On the 4th day, the weather turned. Cold rain swept the streets, stinging sideways under a bruised sky. Mark figured Rex wouldn't be out in it, but as he rolled past, his wipers slashing the view into fragments, there he was, soaked, shivering, but rooted to the same spot. That did it. Mark parked across the street, engine running, and stepped into the rain. "You're gonna freeze out here, boy," he muttered, crouching low. Rex's eyes met his, and for the first time, the dog gave a soft, low whine. Then he looked back at the house. Mark followed the gaze again. The porch sagged under the weight of years, the paint was long gone, and the screen door hung crooked. No movement, no sound. But the hairs on the back of Mark's neck rose. That evening, Mark brought it up at the precinct. A couple of officers joked about the haunted house mutt, but Sergeant Coleman leaned back in his chair, frowning. "That property's been a ghost for decades. Code enforcement's been after it, but the owner's MIA. You thinking there's something inside?" "I'm thinking my gut's telling me it's not nothing," Mark said. Coleman shrugged. "You want to dig? File for a search warrant. You know the drill." Mark knew the drill, but he also knew warrants for abandoned houses with no clear probable cause took time, and time wasn't a luxury if something was going on in there. 2 mornings later, Mason Creek woke to a brittle frost that turned every branch into glass. Mark swung by the house again. This time Rex wasn't on the curb. He was at the rusted gate, front paws planted, tail stiff, a deep growl rumbling in his chest. Mark got out of the cruiser slowly. "What is it, boy?" Rex barked once, sharp, urgent, then trotted up the cracked path toward the porch. He stopped at the front door and pawed at it, nails clicking against the rotted wood. Not the restless scratching of a bored dog. This was deliberate. Mark glanced around the empty street. "You're really trying to tell me something, huh?" I've seen animals lead people to things nobody else could find, Mark thought, rubbing the dog's damp fur. That's why I love hearing stories like this. If you're the kind of person who believes animals are heroes in their own right, stick around, and you might want to subscribe to Heroes for Animals. You won't believe where this one's headed. Back in the cruiser, Mark typed a quick message to Coleman. Need warrant for 119 Oak Street, possible K9 alert. He hit send before he could talk himself out of it. While waiting, he did some digging of his own. County records, old news archives. The property's tax bill had been unpaid for years. Last registered owner, a shell company in another state. That alone was suspicious. Still, without a warrant, the most he could do was watch. And Rex made sure he did. Every day, rain or shine, the dog kept his vigil. One night on his way home, Mark slowed as he approached Oak Street. His headlights washed over the house's sagging porch. In that moment, he thought, no, he was sure. He saw a movement behind an upstairs window. Just a flicker, a shadow shifting, then nothing. He braked, rolled down the window. The street was silent except for the ticking of the engine. Then, from the shadows near the gate, two amber eyes reflected the headlights. Rex stepped into the light, soaked from the mist, and barked once. It was the kind of bark that leaves no room for debate. The warrant came through 3 days later. When Mark parked in front of the house that morning, 2 patrol cars were already there. He stepped out to find Rex waiting by the gate, tail wagging slightly as if to say, about time. Let's see what you've been watching, partner, Mark muttered. The lock on the front door was flimsy, giving way with a twist of the pry bar. The air that seeped out was stale and cold, with a faint undertone of something wrong. The floor creaked under their boots as they stepped inside. The living room was bare. No furniture, no personal items, just peeling wallpaper and the faint smell of mildew. Clear, called Officer Vega from the kitchen. But Rex wasn't interested in the kitchen. He'd already slipped into the hallway, nose low to the floor, tail stiff. He stopped in front of what looked like a closet door, then pawed at it. Mark tried the knob, locked. Get me the crowbar, he said over his shoulder. Vega brought it, and with a grunt, Mark forced the door open. Instead of shelves, a set of narrow wooden stairs disappeared into blackness. The air from below was colder, heavier. Rex stepped forward, his head low, sniffing the void. Then he descended without hesitation. Mark clicked on his flashlight and followed. The beam of light swept across damp concrete walls. The basement was larger than he expected, the ceiling low enough that he had to duck. Rex padded ahead, his nails clicking on the floor. Halfway across, he stopped at another door. Metal this time, bolted from the outside. His tail was rigid, his ears forward, his body vibrating with focus. Mark's stomach tightened. What the hell is this? Vega caught up, shining his own light. This isn't code legal. None of this is. Mark placed a hand on the bolt. It was stiff but gave way under force. The door creaked open, the sound echoing in the cold dark. Inside, the beam of light barely reached the far wall. Something shifted in the shadows. Mark took a step forward and froze. Mark's flashlight cut a thin blade of light through the cold, stale air. His breath came out in visible puffs. The moment the metal door swung open, the temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Rex stood in the doorway, muscles tense, head lowered. He didn't bark this time, just waited, his amber eyes flicking from Mark to the darkness beyond. What is it, boy? Mark whispered. The beam of light swept slowly over the space. The room beyond wasn't small, 20 feet across maybe, but it was nearly empty. Dust drifted in the light, and somewhere in the distance, water dripped steadily. Vega stepped in behind him, muttering, creepy as hell. They took a few steps inside. The floor was concrete, cracked in places. Rusty pipes snaked along the walls. There was a faint odor, mildew, stale air, and something Mark couldn't quite place. Rex moved toward the far wall, his nails clicking against the floor. He stopped at a section where the concrete looked slightly different, darker, rougher. He sniffed along the seam, then pawed once. Mark frowned. Vega, shine your light here. The beam revealed what Mark had already guessed. A second door. This one wasn't metal. It looked like thick, weathered wood reinforced with horizontal steel bars. It was also locked. Mark knelt, running his fingers over the surface. There were scratches in the wood, some shallow, some deep. Not random gouges. These were patterns, lines that looked almost like someone had dragged something sharp again and again over the same spots. Vega shifted uneasily. You thinking what I'm thinking? Yeah, Mark said, but I'm hoping we're wrong. The lock wasn't new. It was a heavy, old-fashioned padlock, the kind you didn't pick so much as you broke. Vega handed over the crowbar, and Mark wedged it under the shackle. It groaned, resisted, then snapped with a metallic cry that echoed through the basement. He looked at Rex. Ready? Rex sat back on his haunches, tail stiff, eyes fixed on the door. When the door swung open, the smell hit them first. It was stronger now, mildew, damp wood, and another layer beneath it that made the hairs on Mark's arms stand on end. He stepped inside slowly, sweeping his flashlight left to right. The beam caught rough stone walls, a low ceiling supported by wooden beams, and a corridor that stretched deeper than he'd expected. The sound of water dripping somewhere echoed unnaturally, as if the space were bigger than it looked. Rex moved ahead, nose working furiously. He stopped at a corner and glanced back at Mark. They followed him into a narrow hallway. The walls here were different, lined with plywood, as though someone had tried to hide whatever was behind them. At the end of the hallway was another door, lighter wood this time with a flimsy latch. Mark hesitated, one hand on the handle. Vega looked at him. We call for more units? Mark shook his head. Let's see what we've got first. If it's nothing, I don't want the whole precinct laughing at us for chasing ghosts. Rex gave a short, sharp bark. Mark took that as his answer. The latch gave easily. The door opened inward with a long, low creak. His flashlight revealed a small room, 10 by 12 at most. Empty except for a few broken chairs and a rusted metal cot against the wall. The mattress was gone, but there was a thin layer of dust over everything, except one chair which had a faintly polished seat, as though someone had sat there recently. Vega stepped closer. That dust pattern. Mark, somebody's been down here. Mark scanned the corners. No footprints. They'd have been obvious on the dusty concrete, which meant either someone had been very careful or the dust had settled long after the room was used. Rex sniffed the cot, then padded to the far wall and started sniffing along the floor. Mark followed, running his light over the baseboards. That's when he saw it, a thin line cut into the dust, curving toward the wall as though something heavy had been dragged and leaned against it. He crouched, pressing lightly against the wall. It flexed just enough to tell him it wasn't solid. This isn't a foundation wall, he said. What is it then? Vega asked. Mark straightened, the unease in his gut deepening. Something someone built to hide something else. They spent the next 15 minutes checking every inch of the basement. Most of it seemed like standard, neglected storage, rusted shelves, broken tools, cracked paint cans. But the layout didn't make sense. The walls didn't match the footprint of the house above. Somewhere down here, there was more space. Rex was the one who found it. He led them to a corner of the basement where an old water heater stood cold and unused. The floor behind it was covered in a layer of plywood. Rex sniffed, pawed once, and sat. Mark and Vega dragged the water heater aside, revealing a crude trapdoor cut into the concrete floor. Vega let out a low whistle. You've got to be kidding me. The trapdoor had no handle. They pried it open with the crowbar, and a rush of air, cold, damp, stale, hit them in the face. Mark angled his flashlight downward. Narrow wooden stairs descended into complete darkness. The steps looked worn, edges rounded from use. He glanced at Vega. You armed? Vega patted his sidearm. Always. Mark looked at Rex. Stay close, buddy. And they went down. The stairs ended in another hallway. This one carved directly into packed earth. Wooden beams shored up the ceiling, and faint mold crept along the edges. Mark's flashlight caught glimpses of scuff marks on the ground. Shoe prints, some small, some larger. The hallway ended at another door. This one was heavier, steel again, but newer than the rest. A thick bolt locked it from the outside. Mark ran his hand over the bolt. It was slick with condensation. Rex's ears were pricked and threw forward. His nose pressed to the gap beneath the door. He gave a soft whine. Mark's instincts flared. He'd been in situations like this before, serving warrants where things went sideways fast. But something about this was different. He could feel it in the cold air, in the absolute stillness of the space. Vega looked at him, voice low. We opening it? Mark nodded once. He slid the bolt free, the metal squealing against the latch. The sound echoed down the hallway like a warning. When the door swung open, the darkness beyond was absolute. He stepped inside, flashlight beam cutting through the black. The air was heavier here, the smell stronger, damp concrete, stale sweat, and something faintly metallic. The beam caught shapes in the corner, small shapes, Vega came in behind him, light sweeping wider. The shapes resolved into objects, bundles of fabric, a cracked plastic chair, a stack of dented metal trays. Rex moved ahead, tail low, sniffing the air. Then he froze. Mark followed his gaze toward the far end of the room. There was another door there, smaller, almost hidden in shadow. Unlike the others, this one was just plain wood, no lock visible. Something about it made the hair rise on Mark's arms. Vega's voice was barely above a whisper. This is too much for just the two of us. Mark didn't answer. He was listening. Somewhere behind that small door, faint but unmistakable, came a sound that didn't belong in an empty basement. It was quick, almost like a breath or a muffled crow. Rex turned to look at Mark, eyes wide, ears pricked. He gave a short, urgent whine. Mark's voice was steady, but his pulse was pounding. Okay, buddy, let's see what's on the other side. He reached for the handle and froze when the sound came again, this time clearer. A voice, small, frightened. Mark's fingers hovered over the small wooden door's handle. The voice, or whatever it was, had gone quiet again, swallowed by the thick, damp air of the underground space. Vega's flashlight beam shook slightly as it traced the edges of the door frame. You heard that too, right? Mark nodded. Yeah. Rex stood frozen, his weight forward, ears trained on the door. His body language was clear. This matters. Mark's gut twisted. Years on the job had taught him to trust two things, his instincts and the instincts of a good dog. Right now, both were telling him the same thing. He turned the handle slowly. The wood was worn smooth from use, and the latch clicked softly under his grip. The door pushed inward with only a faint creak, revealing another hallway. It was smaller than the others, narrow enough that Mark's shoulders brushed the walls if he stood dead center. The floor was dirt, uneven, with scattered footprints pressed deep into it. Some were small, too small for an adult. Vega caught a sight of them too. Kids, he muttered. Mark didn't answer. The thought lodged in his mind like a splinter. The air here was colder, heavier. Mark's flashlight swept ahead, revealing a series of rough wooden partitions on either side of the hall. They weren't solid walls, more like crude stalls or cubicles. From somewhere farther down, a faint metallic clink echoed, followed by silence. Rex moved forward, his breathing audible in the stillness. Every few steps, he paused to sniff at the base of a partition before pressing on. They passed the first stall, empty, just a pile of old blankets in the corner, matted and dusty. The second stall had a single chair with one leg broken clean off. The third, Mark's light froze on it. On the wall, scratched into the wood, were marks. Tallies, maybe 20 or 30, grouped in uneven lines. Below them, faint letters were carved into the wood, so rough they were barely readable. Mom. Vega let out a slow breath. What the hell happened down here? Mark shook his head. Let's just keep moving. Halfway down the hall, the ground dipped slightly. The smell changed too, less mildew, more of that metallic tang that made the back of Mark's throat tighten. The hallway ended in another door. This one was different, newer wood with a fresh coat of paint that looked almost out of place in the otherwise decayed basement. Rex stopped in front of it, sitting back but never breaking his stare. Mark crouched beside him. You've been leading us here the whole time, haven't you? Rex gave a small, quiet whine, then glanced up at the handle. Vega stepped forward, his voice low. We don't have backup in place yet. We open this. We're committed. Mark straightened. We've already crossed that line. He reached out, hands steady despite the adrenaline buzzing in his veins, and turned the knob. The door opened into a larger room, dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The bulb flickered weakly, casting the space in a trembling yellow glow. Against the far wall stood 3 narrow beds, metal frames with thin, stained mattresses. Beside them, a low table held a metal pitcher and a few cracked cups. On the floor, scattered toys lay abandoned. A small plastic truck missing its wheels, a faded stuffed rabbit, a jigsaw puzzle with pieces warped from damp. The air was warmer here, but the warmth did nothing to ease the chill crawling up Mark's spine. Then came the sound again, a quick intake of breath, like someone had been holding it for too long. Mark's flashlight darted toward the corner of the room, where a curtain of rough fabric hung from the ceiling. He moved toward it slowly, each step deliberate. Rex patted at his side, silent now. Mark reached out, gripped the edge of the fabric, and pulled it back. Nothing. Just another empty stall, a thin blanket folded neatly in the corner. Vega exhaled in relief, but only for a second, because from somewhere behind them a faint thud echoed. Both men spun, lights cutting across the room. Rex was already moving, nose low, tracking the sound to a section of wall that looked wrong. The boards here were newer, nailed haphazardly, and a faint draft of warmer air seeped through the gaps. Mark ran his hand along the boards, feeling for movement. One plank shifted under the pressure of his palm. "Help me with this," he told Vega. They pried the boards loose one by one until an opening emerged, small but big enough for a child to slip through. Mark shone his light inside. The beam landed on a small space barely bigger than a walk-in closet, and in that space, two wide eyes stared back at him. The child, maybe 8 years old, was crouched low, arms wrapped around their knees. Their hair was tangled, their clothes worn thin. For a moment, they didn't move. Then their gaze flicked to Rex, and something in their expression shifted. Rex stepped forward, lowering himself so his head was level with the child. He gave the softest, most careful whine Mark had ever heard. The child blinked once, twice, then reached out with a trembling hand. Rex didn't move until the hand touched his fur. Then his tail wagged just once, slow. Mark crouched, low, speaking gently. "Hey there, you're safe now. We're the police." The child's lips parted, but no sound came out. They looked from Mark to Vega, then back to Rex. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, they said, "There's more." Mark felt his chest tighten. "More what?" The child swallowed hard. "More kids." Vega's eyes met Mark's over the child's head. They didn't need to say it out loud. They both knew this just became something much bigger than they'd imagined. Mark glanced toward the darkened hallway behind them. The rest of the space suddenly felt alive with possibility. Doors they hadn't opened, corners they hadn't checked. He turned back to the child. "Can you show us?" The child hesitated, then nodded once. Mark helped them out through the opening. Their legs were shaky, so he steadied them with one hand. Rex stayed close, his presence oddly grounding. The child led them back into the hallway, toward another door they'd passed earlier without thinking twice. It was unremarkable, just another wooden slab, paint peeling in long strips. But when Mark pushed it open, he knew instantly this was different. The smell was stronger here, more bodies, more heat. Rows of crude wooden bunks lined the walls. Each one had a thin blanket, some in better shape than others. In the dim light, Mark could see small shapes shifting under them. Eyes open, dozens of them. Some fearful, some curious, all too quiet for children this young. Mark's heart pounded. He counted quickly. 7, 8, 9. He stopped at 11. 11 kids in this room alone. He forced his voice steady. "It's okay, we're here to help." A few of the kids glanced at each other but didn't move. The child who had led them here stepped forward, gesturing to Rex. "It's him! He found us!" Rex padded into the room, sniffing each bed in turn. His tail wagged faintly as he checked on each child, his movements slow and deliberate. Mark watched, a lump forming in his throat. This wasn't random. Rex hadn't just stumbled on something. He'd known. Vega stepped closer to him. "We've got to call this in now." Mark nodded, but his eyes stayed on the children. "Yeah, and we're not leaving until every last one is out of here." From somewhere deeper in the basement, another sound echoed, a door closing, slow and deliberate. Mark's head snapped toward the hallway. Whoever had been keeping these kids here was still around. He turned to Vega. "Get them upstairs, now." And to Rex, "With me." The shepherd's ears went up. His body shifted from gentle comfort to sharp readiness in an instant. Whatever was coming next, Rex was ready for it. The sound of the door closing echoed through the basement like a warning bell. Mark froze, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of his sidearm. Vega caught his eye. "That came from the far side," he whispered, already herding the children toward the hallway. Mark nodded. "Get them out. Don't stop until you're topside." The kids were hesitant at first, but when Vega gestured toward the narrow stairs, they began to shuffle forward in a quiet single-file line. The older ones put their arms protectively around the younger ones. The little boy who'd led them here looked over his shoulder at Mark, his eyes wide. Mark gave a small nod. "You're safe now. Go with him." Rex stayed by Mark's side, his posture stiff, ears forward. The dog's breathing was slow but controlled, a working stance Mark recognized from his years with other canine units. He crouched beside him, murmuring, "All right, partner, we're not done yet." Rex's amber eyes never left the shadowed hallway ahead. They moved toward the sound's origin, Mark leading with his flashlight, Rex tracking just ahead. The corridor felt even narrower now, the air thicker. Somewhere above, faint thuds marked the kids' progress toward the surface. The hallway ended at another steel door, heavier than the others, bolted from the outside. Mark reached out, fingers brushing the latch. It was warm, recently touched. He slid the bolt back slowly, listening. The door swung open to reveal a large, dimly lit chamber. The light came from a single bare bulb hanging crookedly from the ceiling, swaying slightly as though disturbed moments ago. The walls were lined with shelves holding boxes, cans, and what looked like plastic jugs. Rex sniffed the air sharply, a low growl starting in his chest. Mark swept the beam of his flashlight across the room, landing on a shadow moving near the far wall. "Police, let me see your hands." The figure froze, then bolted toward a narrow passage on the right. Mark lunged forward, but the maze-like layout of the room slowed him. Rex, however, was a blur, his paws hammering the concrete, nails scraping as he banked into the side corridor. Mark followed, the beam of his flashlight jerking with each stride. The passage twisted sharply, opening into a smaller space cluttered with crates. The figure was gone. Rex was at the far end, nose to the ground, tail rigid. He lifted his head and looked back at Mark, then toward another opening, this one partially blocked by a stack of wooden pallets. Mark squeezed past the pallets, stepping into a space that looked more like a crude tunnel than a room. The ceiling was lower here, the floor uneven. Fresh footprints marred the dirt, large, boot-sized, heading deeper into the dark. Rex gave a sharp bark, the sound bouncing off the walls. Mark clicked his radio. "Vega, suspects moving underground, possibly toward another exit. Secure the kids and get back up here now." Static crackled, followed by Vega's tense voice. "Copy that. On it." They pressed on, following the tunnel's curve. Mark's light picked up damp spots along the walls and a faint shimmer ahead, the reflection of water. The tunnel opened into a cavern-like space beneath the foundation. Water pooled in the center, fed by a thin trickle from a crack in the wall. The air was colder here, and every sound seemed amplified. On the far side, another opening led upward, likely to a ground-level exit. Rex surged toward it, but Mark caught the faintest movement in his peripheral vision, a shadow separating from the wall. "Stop right there," Mark barked. The figure froze for half a second, then turned slowly. A man, mid-40s, wiry build, clothes streaked with grime. His eyes darted between Mark and Rex, calculating. "Hands where I can see them," Mark ordered. Instead, the man bolted for the exit. Rex exploded into motion, his bark echoing like thunder. In 3 strides he launched, hitting the man square in the side and driving him into the dirt. The impact knocked the air from the man's lungs, and Rex clamped onto his forearm, holding but not mauling. Textbook apprehension. Mark was on them in seconds, cuffing the man's free hand before securing the other. The suspect's face twisted in fury. "You got no idea what you're doing," he spat. Mark leaned close enough for his voice to cut through the man's anger. "I know enough to get those kids out of here, and I know you're done." Rex released on command, but stayed poised over the man, teeth bared in silent warning. Mark keyed his radio. "Suspect in custody. We'll need someone to take him topside." 2 officers met him halfway back through the tunnel, taking the man into their custody. Mark turned to Rex, scratching the dog's head briefly. "Nice work, partner. Real nice." But the job wasn't finished. They retraced their steps to the main basement chamber, checking every locked door, every shadow. In one room, they found shelves lined with canned food and bottled water, enough supplies to last weeks. In another, a small generator sat silent, fuel canisters stacked neatly nearby. It was becoming clear. Whoever ran this operation had planned for the long haul. Mark's radio crackled again. "Vega. We've got the kids outside. EMS is checking them over. Some are dehydrated, but they're all alive." Relief washed through him, but it was tempered by the knowledge that they'd found only some of the voices hinted at by the child earlier. He scanned the far corner of the basement. There, partially obscured by a fallen shelf, was another doorway. Rex was already heading for it. The door wasn't locked, but it was jammed by debris. Mark shoved the shelf aside, its contents spilling with a crash. Inside was a narrow staircase, steeper than the others, leading further down. The air that drifted up was warmer, almost humid. Rex descended first, his body low and cautious. Mark followed, flashlight steady. The stairs ended in a long rectangular room. The walls were stone, the ceiling low enough to force Mark to hunch slightly. And along the back wall, more beds. 7 this time, 4 occupied. The children here were younger, toddlers, maybe 5 years old at most. Their eyes blinked slowly in the light, adjusting. Mark crouched, keeping his voice gentle. It's okay. You're safe now. One little girl clutched a stuffed bear so tightly her knuckles were white. Another reached toward Rex, her expression somewhere between fear and wonder. Rex moved slowly to her side, lowering himself to the ground so she could touch his fur. Mark radioed for another unit to escort the children out. He stayed until he saw each one in the arms of an officer headed upstairs. When the last child was gone, the basement felt different. Emptier, but still heavy with the echoes of what had happened here. He looked at Rex. We're not leaving until we've cleared every inch. They spent another hour combing through the labyrinth. Behind one panel of rotting plywood, they found a stash of personal items. Tiny shoes, worn jackets, school backpacks with faded cartoon characters. Each item told its own story, and none of them ended where they should have. Mark bagged them carefully. Evidence, proof. By the time they emerged into the cold night air, the street was lined with patrol cars, ambulances, and curious neighbors held back by yellow tape. Vega approached, his breath visible in the frigid air. All accounted for? Mark shook his head. Not yet, but we've got more than we started with, and we've got the guy. Rex stood between them, scanning the crowd, as if still on duty. Mark glanced down at him. This doesn't happen without you, buddy. Rex's tail wagged once before he turned his gaze back to the darkened house. The night wasn't over, but the tide had shifted. They were bringing light into the shadows, one step at a time. Cold night air cut against Mark's face as he stepped out of the basement and into the flood of red and blue lights. Paramedics knelt beside bundled children on the curb, wrapping blankets around shivering shoulders, checking small hands for frostbite. Officers moved with quiet urgency, keeping the scene contained but gentle. Vega approached, his breath puffing white in the winter air. That's 17 we've got out so far. Mark's jaw tightened. The kid upstairs said there were more. We're still short. Rex stood between them, scanning the crowd with alert amber eyes. His ears flicked toward the darkened house. Mark crouched beside him. You think we missed something, partner? Rex didn't move. Then after a beat, he turned sharply toward the side of the house and started trotting, nose low. Mark followed, flashlight beam cutting through the frost-furred grass. The side yard was narrower here, the ground sloping toward the rear. Half hidden behind overgrown shrubs was a section of the foundation that looked different. Newer concrete poured against old stone. Rex sniffed along the seam, then sat, glancing back at Mark. Mark stepped closer, running his gloved hand over the surface. Vega, he called quietly. His partner joined him, crouching low. That's not original. No, Mark agreed, and it's hollow. He rapped his knuckles against the slab. The sound was dull, but there was an echo beneath it, like knocking on the lid of a crate. They moved quickly. 2 more officers joined them with pry bars and a sledgehammer. The first swing rang out like a gunshot in the cold night. Concrete cracked, dust spilling into the air. Rex backed up, ears pinned against the sound, but never took his eyes off the spot. After 10 minutes of pounding and chiseling, the slab gave way, revealing a narrow crawl space behind it. A rush of warm, stale air poured out. Mark dropped to his hands and knees, shining his flashlight inside. The beam cut across a dirt floor, wooden support beams, and farther back, what looked like another doorway. I'm going in, he said. Vega frowned. You sure? That thing's barely wide enough for you. Then it's perfect for kids, Mark replied. He slid inside, feeling the cold earth under his palms, the ceiling pressing low enough to force a crawl. Rex followed close behind, his body low but his movement confident. The crawl space ended at a short set of wooden steps leading up to a plain plywood door. It wasn't locked, just wedged shut with a metal rod. Mark worked it loose, the scrape of metal against wood loud in the silence. He pushed the door open slowly. The beam of his flashlight swept over the room beyond and stopped. It was larger than he expected. The walls were made of rough planks and the ceiling sloped low, but it had been lived in. Along one wall sat 6 small beds, each with a thin blanket. In the far corner, a stack of cardboard boxes served as makeshift shelves for clothes and shoes. And in the center of the room, a group of children sat in a tight circle, their faces pale in the light. The oldest couldn't have been more than 12. The youngest, maybe 3. Mark knelt, lowering the light so it wasn't in their eyes. Hey, he said softly. My name's Mark. We're here to get you out. For a moment, no one moved. Then a boy with dark hair and wary eyes spoke. Where's the man? He's not coming back, Mark said. You're safe now. Rex stepped forward, tail wagging slow. Oh, and sniffed gently at the nearest child. The tension in the room shifted, just slightly. One little girl reached out, brushing her fingers over his fur. Mark keyed his radio. "We've got 6 more. Need blankets and EMS down here now." Vega's voice crackled back. "Copy. On the way." He stayed with them until 2 paramedics arrived, passing the kids one by one through the narrow opening. The last child, a boy clutching a battered baseball cap, paused, looking back into the room. "What is it?" Mark asked. The boy hesitated. "There's another place." Mark's pulse kicked up. "Where?" The boy pointed to the far wall, behind the boxes. He crossed the room in 3 strides, moving the boxes aside to reveal a section of plywood paneling. It was hinged, with a small latch near the floor. Rex sniffed at it once, then gave a sharp bark. Mark opened the latch and swung the panel wide. A narrow passage sloped downward, the air growing warmer and more humid the farther it went. They moved quickly, Mark's flashlight bouncing over packed earth walls. The passage turned twice before opening into a chamber that stopped him in his tracks. It was the largest room yet, and it was full. 9 more children sat along the walls, wrapped in blankets and holding cups of water. An officer knelt among them, speaking softly. Vega looked up as Mark entered. "Found them hiding. They were too scared to come out until we got the first group topside." Mark counted quickly. "That's all of them?" Vega nodded. 23 in total. Mark exhaled slowly. The weight of the night pressed down on him. Relief tangled with a cold fury at what these kids had endured. He glanced at Rex, who was moving from child to child, sniffing gently, his tail swaying in that slow, careful way of a dog who knows the moment calls for gentleness. One little boy wrapped his arms around Rex's neck and didn't let go. It took nearly an hour to get everyone topside. Paramedics worked in a steady rhythm, checking vitals, handing out warm drinks, and tucking blankets tighter around small shoulders. Neighbors watched from behind the police tape, their faces pale in the wash of emergency lights. Mark stood at the edge of the scene, scanning it all. The children safe in the back of ambulances, the suspect being loaded into a squad car, Vega giving a statement to a local reporter. Rex stood beside him, finally sitting for the first time in hours. "You did good tonight," Mark said quietly, scratching behind his ears. Rex leaned into the touch, then turned his gaze toward the dark shape of the house. Mark followed his eyes. "Yeah," he said softly, "that place won't hold anyone ever again." When the last ambulance pulled away, the scene began to quiet. Officers packed up gear, crime scene tape fluttered in the wind, and the cold crept back into Mark's bones. Vega walked over, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. "We got them all. 23, not a single one unaccounted for." Mark nodded. "That's the number I wanted to hear." As they headed towards the cruiser, Rex trotted a few steps ahead. His ears relaxed now, his tail swinging with a tired rhythm. Mark knew he'd remember this night for the rest of his career. Not for the arrest, not for the paperwork that would drown them in the morning, but for the sight of Rex guiding them, step by step, toward every locked door, every hidden passage, until not a single child was left in the dark. 3 days after the rescue, Mason Creek was still buzzing. You couldn't walk into the diner without overhearing pieces of the story, how the police found them, how many kids there were, the stranger who'd been keeping them hidden right under everyone's nose. But for Mark Harris, the noise wasn't what stayed with him. It was the silence. Those moments in the basement where the air was thick and still, where the kids' wide eyes said everything their voices couldn't. He sat at his kitchen table now, coffee cooling in front of him, the early morning light slanting across the floor. Rex lay stretched out at his feet, chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The shepherd hadn't left his side since that night. The front door rattled with a knock. Mark pushed back his chair and opened it to find Vega, hands full, 2 paper cups of coffee in one hand, a folded newspaper under his arm. "Figured you could use the caffeine," Vega said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Mark smirked. "You're not wrong." Vega dropped the paper on the table. The front page was a full-color photo of Rex sitting on the sidewalk that night, a blanket draped around his shoulders, 2 kids leaning into him. The headline read, "Hero Canine Helps Save 23. Mark stared at it for a long moment. That's going to be the picture people remember. "They should," Vega said, settling into a chair. "He earned it." Rex lifted his head at the sound of his name, then went back to resting. The day unfolded slowly. Reporters called. A TV crew wanted an interview. Mark turned most of them down. He wasn't interested in turning the case into a media circus. The kids needed privacy, not flashbulbs. Still, there were meetings, The mayor wanted to present commendations. The school board sent a thank you letter. A church group organized a clothing drive. Everywhere he went, people stopped him to ask about Rex. By late afternoon, he finally made it to the station. The lobby was busier than usual, donors dropping off toys, blankets, gift cards. Mark saw the front desk officer stacking boxes into neat piles. In the corner, one of the rescued kids sat with a social worker, coloring quietly. The little boy who'd first told Mark there were more kids looked up, spotted Rex, and broke into a grin. "Rex," he called. The dog trotted over, tail wagging, and sat in front of the boy. The child wrapped both arms around his neck, holding on for a few seconds before pulling back. "You doing okay?" Mark asked. The boy nodded. "They gave me new shoes." He stuck out a sneakered foot like proof. "That's good," Mark said. "You deserve them." The boy leaned close, his voice dropping. "I wasn't scared when you came, because Rex was there." Mark felt his throat tighten. "Yeah," he said softly. "Me too, kiddo." Later that evening, Mark drove home along the winding back road that cut through the edge of town. The air smelled of wood smoke and the faint sweetness of fallen leaves. Rex sat in the passenger seat, head out the window, ears flapping in the wind. The shepherd seemed lighter now, the tension gone from his posture. Mark thought about the moment he'd first seen him, sitting in the rain outside that old house. How easily it could have been missed. When they pulled into the driveway, the sky was a deep blue, the first stars just appearing. Mark let Rex out and watched him trot to the porch, pausing to sniff the air like he was cataloging the whole neighborhood. Inside, Mark filled Rex's bowl, then poured himself another cup of coffee. He stood at the kitchen window, looking out toward the dark tree line. For the first time in a long while, the quiet didn't feel heavy, it felt earned. The following Saturday, the town held a small gathering at the community center. It wasn't fancy, no reporters, no speeches longer than a few minutes. Just neighbors, the rescued children with their temporary guardians, and the officers who'd been there that night. Mark kept to the back, a paper plate of barbecue in one hand, a cup of lemonade in the other. Rex stayed close, accepting the occasional scratch behind the ears from passing kids. When the mayor took the mic, she didn't talk about the arrest or the investigation. She talked about vigilance, about neighbors watching out for one another, about the strange way a dog's persistence had broken open something that might have stayed hidden forever. And she finished, about how sometimes heroes come on four legs. The applause was warm, genuine. Rex perked up at the sound, glancing at Mark as if to check whether he'd done something new to deserve it. Mark crouched beside him. "Yeah, buddy," he murmured. "They're clapping for you." Afterward, as people drifted out, one of the older girls who'd been rescued approached Mark. She held a folded piece of paper. "It's for Rex," she said. Mark unfolded it. Inside was a crayon drawing. Rex in the middle, surrounded by stick-figure children holding hands. Above them in wobbly letters were the words, "Thank you for finding us." Mark swallowed hard. "He's going to keep this forever," he said. The girl smiled shyly, then hugged Rex before heading off. That night, back home, Mark pinned the drawing to the wall above his desk. Beside it, he taped the newspaper photo from Vega. 2 reminders, one for the public story, one for the personal one. He sat down, Rex curling at his feet. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel empty. Mark knew there would be reports to finish, hearings to attend, maybe even a trial where he'd have to testify. But those were just the aftershocks. The real work had been done in the dark, with a flashlight in one hand and a dog leading the way. Before bed, he stepped out onto the porch. The night air was sharp, the sky wide and full of stars. Somewhere down the street, a neighbor's porch light flicked on. Rex came to sit beside him, leaning against his leg. Mark scratched his neck. "You know, buddy, not every case ends like this, but I'm glad this one did." Rex tilted his head, as if he understood every word. Mark smiled. "Come on, let's go inside. We've got a quiet night ahead." The porch light clicked off as they stepped inside, the door closing softly behind them. The old house at the edge of town was boarded up now, a crime scene until the lawyers and the courts were done. But in the small, warm kitchen of Mark's home, with Rex stretched out on the rug, the only thing that mattered was that the dark had been broken, once and for all. Winter in Mason Creek had a way of slowing everything down. Snow softened the streets, the diner kept the coffee hot, and the town seemed to breathe a little easier now that the nightmare was over. For Mark Harris, the days since the rescue had been a mix of paperwork, court prep, In quiet moments that caught him off guard, a child's drawing left in his mailbox, a thank you note from a family he'd never met, a stranger picking up his coffee tab with nothing more than a nod. And always there was Rex. The shepherd had become a local celebrity, though he didn't seem to notice. When they walked through town, people stopped to greet him. Kids ran up to hug him, and shopkeepers slipped him treats under the counter. Mark noticed something else too. Rex had stopped scanning the shadows. No more tense posture, no more fixed stares at the edges of the yard. He seemed lighter, his work done. But every now and then, if they passed the old Miller house, now boarded up and waiting for demolition, Rex's ears would perk and he'd glance at it for just a second before moving on. One afternoon, about a month after the rescue, Mark got a call from the social worker handling the children's cases. "They're all placed now," she said. "Some with relatives, some with foster families. Every one of them is in a safe home." Mark closed his eyes for a moment. "That's good to hear. They still talk about him, you know," she added. "The dog, they ask about him all the time." Mark smiled. "Tell them he's doing just fine." The next Saturday, he and Rex drove out to the community center. A few of the kids were there for an art activity, and when they saw Rex, the room lit up. One by one, they came over, some shy, some bold, to pet him, to bury their faces in his fur. Rex handled it all with quiet patience, tail wagging in a slow, steady rhythm. The little boy who'd first whispered, "There's more," climbed into Mark's lap and stayed there until his foster mom came to collect him. That night, Mark sat at his desk, looking at the newspaper photo and the crayon drawing pinned side by side on the wall. He thought about how close it had come to being just another unsolved mystery, another dark story that never made it to the light. And he thought about how it had started, with a button sitting in the rain, refusing to look away. As winter edged towards spring, the trial began. The man arrested that night was charged with multiple counts of kidnapping, unlawful confinement, and abuse. The courtroom was tense, but the evidence was overwhelming. Mark testified. So did Vega. So did several of the older children, their voices steady as they told the jury about the locked rooms, the hidden passages, the long days without seeing the sun. Rex, of course, didn't testify, but his role was clear in every account. When the guilty verdict came in, it was like a weight lifting off the whole town. That evening, Mark drove out to a quiet overlook above Mason Creek. The valley spread below, the lights of the town glowing warm in the dusk. Rex sat beside him, their breath mingling in the cool air. "You did it, buddy," Mark said quietly. "We both did." Rex turned his head, amber eyes meeting his for a moment before returning to the view. By summer, the old Miller house was gone, demolished and cleared to bare earth. The town voted to turn the lot into a small park with a plaque honoring the courage of the children rescued here and the Mahkid whose loyalty would not let them be forgotten. The day they unveiled it, the kids who could come stood together in the sunshine, some holding hands, some holding on to Rex. Mark kept to the edge of the crowd, but when the mayor finished her speech, she waved him forward. "This town owes a debt," she said, "to Officer Mark Harris and to Rex." The applause was warm, but Mark's eyes were on the children and on Rex, sitting calmly in the grass, tail thumping against the ground. Life settled after that. Mark went back to his regular cases, traffic stops, neighbor disputes, the usual small-town rhythms, but nothing felt quite the same. Some nights, sitting on the porch with Rex at his feet, he'd think about the echo of those basement hallways, the quiet courage of the kids, the way Rex had moved without hesitation toward every locked door. And he'd think about how, in the end, it hadn't been some big flashy lead or a lucky break. It had been persistence, a dog who wouldn't give up. One evening in late August, he took Rex for a walk through the new park. The grass was still growing in, and the plaque stood under a young maple tree. Mark stopped to read it again, the words etched into bronze. He glanced down at Rex. "Not bad for a guy who works for kibble," he said with a smile. Rex tilted his head, then gave a quiet huff, as if to say he had no idea what the fuss was about. As the sun dipped below the hills, Mark knew the story would live on. Not just in the plaque, not just in the newspaper archives, but in the way the town carried itself now. More watchful, more willing to step in. And maybe that was the real victory. From that first rainy afternoon to the final rescue, the thread had been simple: a man and a dog following an instinct until it led them somewhere no one else had thought to look. And because of that, 23 children got to see the sky again. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. Now I'd like to hear from you. If you had been the one to see Rex sitting outside that house, staring at the door, would you have stopped? Or would you have driven on?